It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you in Portugal, a country which I love, and I'm always willing to come back as often as possible, especially at this time of the year, because we are expecting snow in a couple of weeks in Montreal, and it's wonderful to see nice weather. But it's also a great opportunity to talk about one of my 4 obsessions in life, which is trying to understand why people decide to vote or not to vote. And so I thought that I would present you today some of the research that has been done, which gives you some, I guess, food for thought about what could or should be done if we want to increase turnout. So I guess my task, and it's a gamble, and I'm about to be told that the students here are very, very clever, so they can understand very easily all the things. So my task is to present you with a number of facts, and also basically about a dozen studies that have been done on turnout, and try to present them, each of them in about 2 minutes, as clearly as possible, and I'm sure there will be questions. So the structure of my presentation, does it work? No. Oh, it's worked now. So is the following. I will sort of present first some of the facts about turnout. Basically, is there a real turnout decline? Where is turnout highest and lowest in the world? Then I would look at the aggregate of factors that seem to affect voter turnout in general, and also the factors that affect the turnout decline. And then I would move at the individual level and basically look at some of the characteristics of the people who do vote and do abstain. Then look at the attitudes that are related to the decision to vote or to abstain. And finally, examine some of the interventions that have been attempted to try to increase turnout and how they worked or whether they failed at all. And finally, one word about what could or should we do. So the facts. So let's start with the very, very easy facts. There is indeed a turnout decline. And here you have on the screen basically the mean turnout on the basis of registered voters in established democracies from basically the 1970s to now. And there has been basically a 10-point decline in established democracies. So that decline is sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, but there is a decline in almost all countries in the world. And that has happened rather lately. Basically, the turnout decline started mostly in the mid-1980s. Remarkably, in most democracies, turnout was quite stable from the 1950s to the mid-80s. And then from that period, I guess we've observed a decline of 10 points, which is quite important. And by the way, this is excluding countries with compulsory voting. And this is only established democracies. And you see, of course, that Portugal started very high, and that turnout is quite low, around 60%. Secondly, I guess I want to look at where is turnout highest and lowest nowadays. So this is mean turnout in lower house elections in basically since 2010, in this decade. And you see that the countries with the highest turnout are Scandinavian countries. Scandinavia is performing well on almost all indicators of democratic performance, so we're not surprised that you will find turnout to be higher in Scandinavian countries, though I should mention that in a country like Finland, turnout is about 67%. But basically, the performers in terms of high turnout are, as you would expect, Scandinavian countries. While the countries where turnout is low, this list is a bit more surprising. You have first Switzerland. Switzerland, a place where, of course, direct democracy is very much alive. And clearly, one of the reasons why turnout is so low in Switzerland is that they have a lot of elections and referenda, a lot of them. And there is now a literature that suggests that If you got, like many things in life, if you got too many of them, you get basically bored. So there is a real problem in Switzerland because of that. And then you have France, and France is basically the same reason. Now, the legislative elections are held right after the presidential elections, and there are 2 rounds elections, so we have 4 rounds in 2 months. And again, turnout tends to be quite low in legislative elections. It is relatively high in presidential elections, more than 75%. I have nothing to say about Jamaica as such. I have nothing to say about Portugal, which is still a mystery to me. I might come to some understanding later. Japan is a country where campaigns are extremely, it takes only for 2 weeks. So they have 2-week campaign, very, very, very short campaign. This could be a reason why turnout is particularly low in Japan. So these are the facts. So is it? It's not this one? Oh, it's this one. Okay. So now, so looking at the factors that might affect turnout. Why is turnout higher in some countries and lower in other countries? And for this, I'm basically using a study by Daniel Stockheimer, who did a meta-analysis and published only last year. And what he comes out with is the only 3 factors, according to him, that have been shown to be very important in an overwhelming number of studies. So we don't know a lot about exactly why turnout is higher in some countries than others, but that's certainly three of the factors that seem to be clearly important. The first is compulsory voting. If you make voting compulsory, turnout increases. This is not extremely surprising, but I will say a few words about that in a minute. The second one is about important elections, and that is this distinction between first order and second order elections. Turnout tends to be lower in European elections and also usually in local elections compared to national elections. And the third one is small population. So that's also interesting, and I think it basically illustrates the fact that voting is a social activity, and when there's small population, people tend to know each other very well, and there is more pressure to vote and so on. So I think that's one of the reasons why we got this result. Now, a few words about compulsory voting, because that is clearly the best way to increase turnout. If you want to increase turnout, you implement compulsory voting, and I can guarantee that turnout will increase. When you look at studies that compare turnout across countries, there is the very strong result that turnout tends to be about 10 to 15 points higher in countries with compulsory voting. So that's a very robust result. But we still don't know exactly how and why compulsory voting increased turnout. Because countries with compulsory voting has all kinds of sanctions, sometimes no sanctions at all, sometimes weak sanctions, sometimes strong sanctions. Sometimes they are implemented, sometimes they are not. So we don't know yet exactly how and why compulsory voting does increase turnout. Does it increase turnout because people are told that it's their duty to vote? Is it because they want not to have to pay the penalty or not? Are they aware of it or not? We know very little about exactly how compulsory voting works. We know it works, but we don't know exactly how it works. Interestingly, I've mentioned here the turnout in Australia and Belgium because there are two very interesting cases of established democracies with a long tradition of compulsory voting in all elections, by the way, national, local, regional. And you see in Australia, it's 92%. So basically in Australia, this is where there are sanctions. You pay a penalty if you don't vote. The sanctions are implemented and the system is working perfectly. Basically, those who don't vote are those who are ill, cannot vote, are away, and so on. So 92% is extremely high, and it's working very well. The other case I mentioned is Belgium, because this is very interesting. Because Belgium now, they have sanctions, and for the last few elections, they are not implemented. And even if they are not implemented,
the Belgians go to the polls anyway. It's still 89% as an average. So it's very interesting, and it's a big mystery for me, I guess, is whether the Belgians now still vote because they've been socialized to vote, or because they're not aware that the sanctions are not implemented. So we don't know exactly how this is working, but that's certainly a very interesting case to follow. Belgium, of course, is a very fascinating country, almost as interesting as Portugal. Now, compulsory voting. And this is reported some findings from a study I'm doing now with Mathieu Turgeon, who is in Brazil and who also loves Portugal. He's envying my presence here today. And these are preliminary results of a paper in progress. And this is about how compulsory voting works in Brazil. So in Brazil, it's free to vote. It's voluntary from 16 to 18, then compulsory from 18 to 70. And after 70, you're free again to abstain. And the system, there are very small penalties, but they are enforced. And we have this marvelous data on turnout. This is basically in the 2010 presidential election in Brazil. And there were 110 million people who voted. And we have the date of birth of each of them. Each individual who voted, we have the date of birth. And so what we do basically is that we look at the date of birth of everyone and see whether there was a break here at 18 when you're now obliged to vote. And you see that on the screen that there is, in fact, at ED, which is election day, this is people who are 18 on election day and are obliged to vote. And you see that there's a jump here, that when you're obliged to vote, you're much more likely to, of course, to cast a vote than if you're not obliged. And what's interesting as well is that there is also EY, which is election year. And those are the people, the elections are October 3rd. And those people who turn 18 the same year, but after October 3rd, are not obliged to vote. But there seems to be a jump here towards the end of the year. So those who turn 18 on the same year, even if they're not obliged to vote, tend to be more likely to vote, which is a very, very interesting case, which reflects misinformation. We did a survey a couple of weeks ago during the election, and a lot of people are sort of know vaguely that voting is compulsory for 18 to 70, but they don't know exactly when. Is it the date of the election, the calendar year, or something else? And for 70 years, is it 70 done, or after, inclusive or exclusive? There's a lot of information, mass misinformation about this. And we can see the impact. This is for people who do economists or the political scientists. This is a regression discontinuity. It's basically comparing the turnout of those who were born just before or just after the time. So the first one here on the election day, this is basically comparing the turnout of those who turned 18 the week before the election, and who were obliged to vote, compared to those who turned 18 the week after the election and were not obliged to vote. And you can compare the difference in turnout, and you see that the impact, which is the percent increase, is 20%. So basically, compulsory voting has an impact of 20%. And that's a very clean way to establish that impact. But there is also, at the end of the year, another impact of about 12%, which is people who are not formally obliged to vote, but think that they might be obliged to vote because they are born in the same year. So the cumulative impact is pretty big. And you have the same kind of approach at age 70, where now you're free again to vote, and then, of course, turnout declines, and you see the same kind of impact, the percentage decrease here, 17, 11, 30, and 28. So the impact is not only at 70, it's also at 71. Many people think that it's only when you turn 71 that you're obliged to vote. Sometimes also it's because you don't know whether it's at election day or it is at the time during the calendar year. So there's a lot of misinformation, and the total impact of compulsory voting is quite substantial. If you add this, it's clearly probably around 30% percentage point increase in turnout overall. So that's basically this kind of analysis that you can do with compulsory voting in Brazil, and that's certainly one of the things that I can guarantee you that if you worked without compulsory voting, the chances that you increase turnout are very, very good. But this whole debate about the pros and cons that we could come back in Q&A period. I think I'm going to pass this, and I'll go back to the turnout decline. So now it's a study that Filip Kostajka, who is a researcher in Barcelona, and I'm just about to move to England, and myself are doing. And it is basically looking at all the democratic elections since 1945. We have about 1,400 elections. Some of the studies, in some of the cases, we look only at those without compulsory voting, sometimes only in established democracies. And we use what we call fixed country effect, which basically means that we're looking at variations within countries. So we're looking at decline or increase over time. And so we're looking only at trying to explain what makes turnout increase or decrease within a country. And perhaps the most interesting results, as often, are the nil results, the factors that don't seem to have any impact. And there are many of them which has been suggested in the literature which don't seem to have any impact on turnout. Union membership, party membership, pre-21 socialization. This is basically the idea that the people who had the right to vote the first time before they were 21, globalization, different indicators of globalization, GDP growth, left-right polarization. All of these factors that have been mentioned don't seem to explain turnout variation within a country. At the end of the study, we'd also look at some positive results. After all, we really want to explain some of that. And I will just here focus on two of them, the two most important. And the first one is simply a generational replacement. And the variable here is simply the percent of the electorate who is born after 1960. And that seems to be the major factor that accounts for the turnout decline. Basically, and that would be one of my messages here, is that the young generations are less likely to vote for many different reasons. We'll come back to it, but that's certainly a very, very important fact. So young students, your generations, you are responsible for the turnout decline, and we can talk about the reasons for this later on. The second factor is the number of elective institutions. It's basically an indicator of the frequency of elections. And Filip Kostajka, in his dissertation, had looked at this particular in the case of new democracies, and there seems to be a clear connection with the number of elections and a decline in turnout. So clearly one of the reasons why turnout is declining is that we have, in many countries, many more elections than before because of the European elections, because you have presidential elections, you may have referenda, you have regional, local. So the number of elections has increased, and there seems to be a clear link with turnout decline. So it seems also to be an important factor to take into account, and that explains the turnout decline. Now let's move to basically who votes. Individual characteristics, determinants of turnout. And basically, there are the two most important are age and education. And I want to say a few words about health. Basically, turnout tends to be about 20 points higher among older people, and we'll see about, let's say, 60 compared to younger people, let's say, at age 20. So it's about a 20-point difference. And in most countries, it varies across countries, of course. And the same basically difference between the least educated and the more educated, the better educated. So basically, it's a 20-point differences. But it's not always clear exactly what's going on here in each case. And for the first factor, reporting a study we did in Canada for elections between 1968 and 2000, pulling all the surveys and so on, and looking at the impact of generation age, life cycle, and also periods. And as you can see in this table, as one gets older, one is more likely to vote. This is a life cycle effect. You get married, you buy a house, you members of associations, you got all things to do, and you're more likely to vote. This is the life cycle effect, which is there. But what's most important for us is the generation effect. So we compare the turnout rates at the same age, at different time elections, at the same age, or different generations. And here, basically, baby boomers 1945 to 1960, then those born in the 60s and 70s. And basically, the last two generations are, each of them, about 10 points less inclined to vote. So in Canada, at that period of time, turnout declined by about 15 points, from 75 to 60%. And most of that decline can be imputed to the fact that young voters at the same age were less inclined to vote than the previous generations. And that's a very, very crucial part of the story in Canada. And similar studies have been done in other countries, like Finland, for instance, and the pattern seems to be going on in most countries. Not all of them, but in most countries. And this is now a look at, this is a forthcoming book by John Olbein and Sunshine Illigus. This is the first draft of a book that will probably come up only a year or two from now. And they look at, this is Making Young Voters is the tentative title of the book. And this is a book about the US only, but in the first intro, they compare it to other countries. And this is the age gap in turnout between those 60 and over and those who are 18 to 29, sort of the age gap. And the age gap is biggest of all in the US. And probably because registration is so difficult in the US, that's certainly one of the main reasons. But interestingly here, you've got then Bulgaria and Portugal. So Portugal seems to be one of the countries where the age gap is the strongest of all, which also suggests probably a generational replacement. Education now. As I mentioned, basically the difference between the better educated and the least educated is about 20 percentage points in turnout propensity. But what is it exactly that's going on? Is it the content of education or not? And my basic conclusion here is that it's not. Sorry, students, I don't think that the fact that you're going to be better educated is going to increase your propensity to vote a lot. So this is a study by Michael Persson, a Swedish author who studied Britain, and it's based basically on a longitudinal studies of people who were born in April 1970. And they basically follow these persons, and every 5 years there is a survey of them. And this is a study done in 2004, at what time the people were aged 34, and there was a question about whether they voted in the previous election. And they had tons of data about these people, especially about family income, education, family education, books in the house, cognitive abilities, tons of information. And so that basically what they did here is matching, so that basically they match every individual who has with a college degree with someone without a college degree. They match it on all the other indicators. And when you do that, the initial turnout gap between those with college degree and no college degree, which is 15 points, shrinks to 4 points. That 4 points, which is not statistically significant, but probably substantially interesting, indicates that there is an impact of college degree, but a very small impact. There is a correlation, but university as such doesn't have a lot of impact. And the same pattern can be found in another book that is coming out in, I think it's January 2019, by Marcus Pryor, Oct. I strongly recommend the book. It's an awesome book. And it's basically look at political interest, not turnout, political interest, development of political interest. And Marcus Pryor examines longitudinal studies household studies, which basically start interviewing people at around between 12 and 15, and every year after that. Ask tons of questions about sexuality, education, health, and so on. But there is one question every year about general interest in politics. And he looks at the impact of all kinds of things. He has a chapter on parents' impact. It has a chapter on education and a chapter on money. And on education, basically, this is this example of a result. Basically, you can see that at the end, there is about a 20-point difference between those who finished their high school and those who didn't. So 20-point difference. So that's pretty big. But you can see that even before they started their high school, that difference was there. There was a 10-point difference. So in that case, the net impact on interest is about 10 points, which is quite important. But what's interesting is that Pryor finds that there is no impact in Switzerland, and there is no impact in Germany. It's only in Britain that there seems to be an impact of high school. And he does the same with university education. In all three countries, he finds no impact. So it's true overall that education is correlated with turnout, but it's not clear at all that it is the content of education that is producing that effect. A word now about health. It makes a lot of sense to assume that those who don't have good health are less likely to vote. This is a fascinating study by a group of people in Finland. By the way, I have all the references. If you want to have the PowerPoint presentation, all the references, you can email me. It will be a pleasure to send it to you. And this is a study of 400,000 people in Finland. And in Finland, you have validated turnout. So you have this is a public record. And these authors, these researchers could relate this to medical record. And this is about chronic hospital-based diseases. And they have 17 of them, 17 different diseases. And by the way, surprisingly, 30% of the electorate have some chronic disease, which I find very, very, very surprising. So it's a lot of people. And then they look at their turnout. And they also control for other social demographic characteristics. And for about half of these diseases, there is no significant difference. For instance, having heart disease doesn't have any impact on turnout. And when it has, the impact is remarkably low. The overall turnout is 68%, and you have in red, it's without any controls, and then the other one is with controls. And in dementia, of course, it makes a lot of sense that it decreased turnout a lot, but even alcoholism, in fact, adjusted turnout is 60% compared to 68%, so only an 8-point difference. And in most cases, it's only a few points differences. So this is another sort of a very amazing result. I really expected strong effects. And in that study, there are some effects, but they are, in my mind, stunningly small. And we have basically the same kind of results in the studies where now it's a survey, and people are basically asked the question, how is your health generally? And you have very good, fair, bad, and very bad. And controlling for all other characteristics, the impact of bad is only 5-point difference, and very bad is 10 points. In these surveys, reported turnout is always higher, about 80%. It's overestimated. But basically here, what's indicated that health has an impact, but in my mind, has a remarkably small impact, much smaller than I would have expected. Now, attitudes. We've got social demographics, now attitudes. And the political science literature has explored dozens of attitudes. Now I'm going to present you my own take, what really matters according to me. And the two attitudes are political interest, general political interest, and sense of civic duty. According to me, these are the two basic attitudes. So let's look at political interest. Political interest is clearly correlated to turnout. It makes sense. if you are interested in politics, it's normal to vote. But you have to keep in mind that if you're not interested, the normal thing is also not to vote, and we have to keep that in mind. So the results I show here is really the impact of political interest on turnout in a big study which we've done in 24 different elections in 5 countries. And in those elections, 5 different countries, subnational, national, and supranational elections, average turnout is 60%. And if you have someone who is at 3 on the 0 to 10 scale, the turnout, predicted turnout is about 40%. And if you're at 9, it's about 70%. So it's basically a 30-point increase in turnout related to whether you're relatively low interest, relatively high interest. And what we know, I should also add, is that this is Pryor's book again, is that political interest is stunningly stable over time. It's remarkably stable that there's very, very little impact of outside events. You get interested in politics, you keep interested, you're not interested, you probably remain uninterested. So it's very difficult to move political interest. The second one is sense of civic duty. And people who know me know that this is my real passion in life. I'm convinced that this is an extremely important attitude. So it's attitude that even though you have the right not to vote, still it is your duty to vote. You feel that the good citizens should vote and that it is your moral obligation to vote. And if you want to know whether you have this sense of civic duty, I will ask you to think about how you would feel if you were to decide that you would not vote in an election. I would personally feel guilty. Guilt is, I think, a very good indicator of whether you have a sense of duty or not. So this is a study that is forthcoming with Chris Aiken in the US, and this is a turnout in the 2008 election, and we have a measure of duty and another measure, which is how much you care who wins the elections, which is strongly correlated with political interest. And basically, if you look at the right-hand side, this is about those who are very interested and care a lot. Duty doesn't make much difference. You don't have to sense of duty if you're always interested. You're going to vote. But the big story is on the left-hand side, and this is people who don't care about who wins. We're not interested in politics. Then it makes a huge difference whether you feel that you have a duty to vote or not. Those who don't have a duty to vote, the predicted turnout is about 5%. And if you have a strong sense of duty, it goes to about 70%. So this is in that group, I think. So the combination of political interest and civic duty, I think, is extremely interesting. Now, a few words about basically about the social aspect of voting. So this is a very interesting paper by Betty, it's not yours, Betty and al. On Danish elections. Turnout is very high in Danish elections. Danish colleagues have wonderful kind of data. And this is basically a data with over 2 million people in various Danish elections. And it's basically about whether people vote alone or not. And it's remarkable that a lot of people do not vote alone. You have the people who vote together as percentage of all voters, 51, 45, 41, voting together as percentage of all voters living with someone else, 68, 59, and 56%. So those who don't live alone usually vote with their partner most of the time. And that's remarkable. And because that's, the time, so that it's really, if another person voted on less than 1 minute after the other one and has the same address, this is an indication that the person didn't vote alone. So I think it's the title of this paper, it's a group thing, I think is very interesting. And in this same study, this is the impact of having a partner. This is comparing turnout in municipal elections in 2000 and 2013. And if you had no partner initially, and you don't have you still have, without a partner, probability of voting is 40%. It increased to 50% if you gain a partner within the last 4 years. And it's the same if you lose a partner. Among those who have a partner, so if you have a partner and you still have a partner, the turnout is about 45%. If you lose a partner, it goes down to 40%. So that's a very sort of important dimension that I think we should keep in mind, is that voting is a social activity. And the people who vote alone, who are alone, are the most likely not to vote in elections. There's 2 minutes left, so I wonder whether I should move to the conclusion, probably. So there are very interesting things on intervention to increase turnout. I can talk about them in the question period. Perhaps one person would be kind enough to ask me to show these slides. Who knows? So what should be done? I don't have easy answers. I don't have easy answers first and foremost because I think the decision to vote or not is based on motivation. It's based on interest and sense of civic duty, and these attitudes are stable and very difficult to move. And because of that, I think that we should be realistic. We cannot increase turnout that much. That being said, we can do something, and we should do something because turnout should be as high as possible. And I think that a turnout of 60% is not good. We should try to increase it, let's say to at least 70%. But let's be realistic. Let's recognize the fact that this is going to be tough. How to do it? Try to make voting as easy as possible. For instance, this means long voting hours. This means having polling stations very close to where people are. This is having mock elections in schools so that people understand exactly what you do in the polling station. Perhaps many people don't know. So there are all kinds of small things. But I should also say that one of the slides I didn't show you is that they've tested advanced voting in North America. And in the US, there is a very interesting research which indicates that advanced voting, early voting, 40% of Americans vote early. In some states, it's a majority. And, but some states do have, some states don't have it, so you can assess the impact of early voting. And the best estimate is that early voting had a negative impact on turnout of 2 or 3 points. And this is probably because election day is not special enough when you can vote a lot early. So 14 seconds, okay. Then making voting a community event. Basically, this is my point. It is a social act. You should make it fun, a family thing. Now, in my province now, we encourage parents to come and vote with their kids. In fact, in the last election, there was a special booth for the kids where they could vote on something else. I think we should do things together all the time. In Australia, after the election, there is, in the schools, there is coffee and donuts that are sold for the school and so on, so that you can really activate. And voting is, one way of saying that you're a member of the community, and we should make it very, very, very special. And making it special means few elections. I think we should be very careful about not having too many elections. I would argue that elections should be held always at the same date or time of the year, not occur too often. They are special, and we should go and vote. Thank you.
So I think we're going to try to have some questions, algumas perguntas. So, André, I think you might need for translation, because questions might be in Portuguese.
Are they okay?
Judite, não sei se
Não,
dirige
é apenas justamente para lembrar que, a pedido agora do Nuno Garoupa, para lembrar que há aqui um período de perguntas e respostas para que haja possibilidades da assistência e interagir com com os dois palestrantes e, portanto, já estou ali a ver um sinal. Dois, aliás.
Perhaps you can translate to me if they are.
Okay, so we will. There's a question there, up there. There's a question here. Convinha ver o tradutor.
To be in English or in French?
Good morning. I can ask this in English.
In English, okay. It's going to be in English.
My name is João Paulo Batalha. I'm the chairman of the Portuguese chapter of Transparency International, so an anti-corruption NGO, which means I spend 80% of my time talking about political will. And that's the question I want to ask you, because isn't there an argument to be made that if you view the problem of voter turnout from the perspective of established political parties, while already represented in parliament, is there not an incentive to keep voter turnout low, or at least controlled? Does it not make elections more manageable for established political parties if they know that half of the electorate is not going to show up to vote? So their job is simply to turn out their core constituency of voters. And that also creates the issue of election as a niche market where a certain political party needs to only talk not of national issues and not talk to all the electorate, but just to their core constituency of, say, civil servants or private sector middle-class workers or pet lovers or whatever. So doesn't it make more manageable if elections don't have a lot of turnout for established political parties? Doesn't that create an incentive for a lack of political will for those types of reforms you mentioned? Thanks.
Thank you, Samantha.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I think established parties have conflicting, I guess, interests. First, like all the political elite, I think all the parties really think that turnout should be as high as possible. I think they're concerned, they're interested, they think that people should be interested in their activities and so on. So that's their first reaction. At the same time, you're right that the established parties are concerned first and foremost about their own votes. So they will canvass, for instance, especially with new techniques, I guess, they will only canvass areas or people that they think are likely to vote or are likely to vote for them. So the new sort of approaches to marketing, for instance, might have an impact on turnout because established parties, at the end, are concerned first and foremost about, of course, their own electoral success. So it's partly right, but at the same time, I think all politicians that I know are really personally deeply concerned about their legitimacy and that have the democracy will be thriving. So I think it's sort of a very conflicting interest.
Okay, we have many hands. So where are the microphones? So there's one there, and then we should come down here because there are a few people here.
Hello, my name is Beatrice. I'm studying international relations at the University of Lisbon. And my question is regarding the early voting. What I have seen, you don't have a very positive insight about it. That's what I got from it. And I would like to know more about it, why you don't think it's a very efficient solution. And your insight on using it in Portugal. Do you think it would work?
I'm sorry, we have a problem that we didn't hear very well here. So I understood the question is about if it's positive in Portugal, but not exactly what is positive. So, early voting.
Oh, early voting.
Early voting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, here the sound is not so good.
Okay, the evidence that we have on early voting is basically based only on the US. And that evidence is pretty robust. And there are many, many different stories. And the fact that it is not increasing turnout, I think in the US is well established. I would add that in Canada, we also have early voting. There hasn't been any exhaustive study of its impact in Canada, but we know that turnout has been decreasing in spite of the fact that there is a lot of early voting. So in other countries, I haven't seen much work about its impact, so it's not impossible that it might have an impact. But the fact is that the overwhelming majority of those who vote early would vote anyway. So it's not clear that so I'm like, I guess, most researchers, I guess I'm skeptical, but still open to evidence. Perhaps in other countries it might work. But for the time being, the evidence suggests otherwise.
Okay, so we had a lot of hands here and no micro. Is there a microphone here? There's no microphone. No, there's a lot of hands here, so please.
Can I just ask a question?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Susana Peralta. I'm a professor of economics here at Nova. So we heard you make a point about compulsory voting, but like on positive grounds, that it would increase turnout. My question is about your normative views on compulsory voting. Thank you.
Okay. I am personally deeply ambivalent about compulsory voting. I am a liberal, small l, and I don't like to force people to do things in general, so that's my first reaction. At the same time, requiring people to vote is not a big thing. We're forced to fill income tax every year, so why not voting? So I'm sort of, I think there's a good argument. The hope of the people who introduced compulsory voting was that people would become more interested in politics. So they want not only voting, but have an impact on information and interest in politics. And the available evidence that I've seen is that it doesn't have that impact. The other consequence that it has is that because more people vote, the gap in income or in education is lower in compulsory voting countries, and that's probably a good thing. So I think there are good arguments for, but also good arguments against. I think we should have a good discussion. I'm open to it. I'm still, I guess, not quite convinced.
Thank you. So here.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Catarina. I work for Reuters in Portugal. My question is a bit off topic, but I think it kind of relates to it. Is there a link, in your opinion, between the lack of far-right in Portugal? So we don't have a lot of extreme right political parties in Portugal compared to other Southern European countries, let's say like Italy, and the lack of political engagement. Is there any link between those two factors?
That's a great question. I don't know that. I think there are a few studies about it, and I'm trying to remember if there's any conclusion or not. What I tell you is that in a study with Philip Kostadka, we looked at the left-right polarization as a factor. And it doesn't seem to be a factor explaining turnout variation within countries. So my inclination is to believe that it is not a factor, but I would like to see the evidence. All I can tell you is that, for instance, in Canada, the number of parties has increased over time. We have a Green Party that we didn't have before, so and turnout is still decreasing. So I guess I do not think so, but I would like to have a closer look at some of the evidence, especially on the far right, as such. But Spain also has the same situation, and turnout is much higher than in Portugal.